Immigration brings different cultures together, but how integrated are our communities? Has multiculturalism in the UK and Europe failed? This is Roundtable with me, Matthew Moore. Here in London, it is, like many places in the European Union, an ethnically diverse place. An example, you might say, of cultures living side by side in relative peace. But that doesn't necessarily translate to togetherness, and some take the view that segregated ethnic groups are a problem. Our reporter Asad Beg is in East London.
Unlike some European countries, Britain has never really had a policy of integration for those that came to live in the UK. Multiculturalism has meant that immigrant communities came and settled here and established communities like this one in East London. They brought with them their food, their clothing, their culture and religion. However, in recent years, some have taken issue with this version of multiculturalism, saying it can lead to segregation.
Under the doctrine of state multiculturalism, we've encouraged different cultures to live separate lives apart from each other and apart from the mainstream.
War der Ansatz zu sagen, jetzt machen wir hier mal Multikulti und leben so nebeneinander her und freuen uns übereinander, dieser Ansatz ist gescheitert. Absolut gescheitert.
Both Britain's former Prime Minister David Cameron and Germany's current leader Angela Merkel said that multiculturalism had not worked. Both called for better integration. Some saw David Cameron's speech as specifically singling out Muslim communities for criticism.
I think he was making a false equivalence between multiculturalism and what he defines as extremism or living a separate life. And I think if we want to discuss those issues, then we need to call them what they are, and multiculturalism isn't what we're discussing.
In Tower Hamlets, British Bangladeshis make up the largest ethnic group at 32% of the borough's population. So, do the criticisms of multiculturalism by Cameron and Merkel resonate on the streets here?
There has been conflicts, there's been a lot of problems. Some communities integrate better than other minorities. Some communities feel like that multiculturalism is changing their towns too much too quickly. But these are challenges that can be overcome. They shouldn't necessarily mean that multiculturalism is a failure.
This area is known for its South Asian restaurants, but now there is growing resentment towards a new wave of immigration from Eastern Europe.
Our old generation, they used to live in this area, they was working in this area, living in this area, but now they don't have any work to do, so they just keep away from the brickline. They can't afford to live there.
Immigration is a contentious issue, and countries across Europe have seen a rise in far-right movements. A few miles down the road from Tower Hamlets, in another part of East London, there seems to be a similar nostalgia of what used to be. And there's resentment against a change that immigration has brought with it.
The white people just moved out, haven't they?
Yeah. Why do you think they move out?
Because they don't treat the same no more.
The white British population in Barking and Dagenham decreased from 80% in 2001 to 49% in 2011. This was also one of the few London boroughs that voted to leave the EU in the Brexit referendum last year. 62% of the borough voting to leave. But for all criticisms of multiculturalism, there are positive examples in mainstream society. British sporting hero Mo Farah came to the UK from Somalia at the age of 8. He went on to become one of Britain's greatest Olympians, winning 4 Olympic gold medals. But it's not only on the track that immigrants and their children have made a difference here in the UK. They've become integral to British society in health, media, politics and business. The story of multiculturalism differs across the UK, but what the EU referendum did was expose deep-rooted frustrations with the idea of it and its impact on Britain. The question is,
Has multiculturalism worked, or is it time for a new approach?
Well, joining me at the round table today is Philip Wood from the Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations at the Aga Khan University. He believes the policy of multiculturalism has broadly failed. We also have Jasper, human rights activist and former advisor to the former Mayor of London. He says migrant communities are unfairly blamed for the failures of multiculturalism. We also have another human rights activist, Heena Khaled. She says that multiculturalism has never really existed in British society. And we also have the Senior Correspondent for the Sunday Times, Andrew Gilligan. He says multiculturalism, as we know it, has been a failure, but that a multicultural society could be successful if there are certain shared values. Mr. Gilligan, let's start with you. There was a question posed there, has it worked? Before we get to that, let's first define multiculturalism. What do you think that word even means?
That's precisely how I was about to start my answer, actually, because I think the problem with multiculturalism, it means different things to different people. And you saw even your reporter mixing it up, confusing it in his own report just there. You saw him conflating it with immigration.
Give us your definition of multiculturalism?
Well, no, I think it's important because it's a politically contested term. To some people, if you contest multiculturalism, that means you're against a multiracial society as well, or a multi-faith society. That's not actually what it should mean. But that's why I don't think it's a particularly helpful term to use. And you saw the reporter in the report there conflating it with immigration, conflating it with a multiracial society.
I'll ask you again, can you give me your definition of multiculturalism? If we can't even start on that point, it's going to be a very difficult discussion.
Well, I think what the critics of multiculturalism mean by it is what you heard Cameron say, where you have communities living separately and not integrating, not owing allegiance to the country as a whole. And that's something which I'd be against. I'm not necessarily sure that's what other people mean by multiculturalism, but that's what Cameron meant by it.
What do you mean by it?
Well, I think I support...
You don't want to use the term?
I support a multiracial society. I think it's brought enormous advantages to this country.
And it's different. That is different to a multicultural society,
absolutely.
Which you would define as...
And I believe that, on the whole, Britain's worked as a multiracial society. I think it's got quite high rates of intermarriage, for instance. It's got quite high rates of BME representation in Parliament. By the usual indicators, Britain is probably less racist than most other Western countries. Okay. And I think multiracialism has broadly worked.
Multiculturalism, your definition?
So I'd say a multicultural society is a society where people are from multiple origins. They come bringing their cultures and religions. And I think in Britain this has brought many advantages, as was spelled out just now, in terms of different perspectives, different skills, different ideas. And I think one of the best indicators for that, as Andrew suggested, is intermarriage. Intermarriage shows trust across potential social boundaries. It shows an ability to build a new culture together, a kind of mutual integration. I think, though, there do remain problems for groups who don't want to marry outside their communities, such as Hasidic Jews or Somalis or many Mirpuri Pakistanis. And I think for these groups, these boundaries are maintained using social distrust and ostracism of individuals who cross those boundaries.
Let me ask you, Jasper, do you think that Britain is a multicultural society?
Well, I think there's some validity in Andrew and Philip's point around the difficulties of the terminology. I think it's certainly multiracial. And that is evident by its obvious demography. I wanted to put the point about intermarriage being a key signifier of the degree in which Britain is an advanced country in relation to relations between other groups.
I just want to talk about multiculturalism, really.
Well, that is multicultural.
We are going to come to that. We are going to come to that. But do you think Britain is a multicultural society? In other words, there are multiple cultures within the society.
But there are definitely multi-ethnic groups with a variety of different cultures.
Okay. And Heena, we're going to definitely come back to that point. But Heena, is Britain a multicultural society?
I think, following on from Philip's point, that it is a multicultural society to some degree, multiracial society. You know, when you look at Britain from an area point of view, we look like a very multicultural society. But for me, the definition is more than just the looks and living together. For me, it's about a society which lives in balance, where there is equality and justice for all across.
But the dominant culture is still dominant, and unfairly so.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, now let's talk about if it's worked, this multicultural society. Mr. Gilligan, if I could ask you, do you think that multiculturalism has worked within this country?
Where multiculturalism has failed is it's been used by some people in some groups to defend practices which are unacceptable in a liberal society. So, for instance, attacking people for not wearing Islamic dress, or indeed for wearing Islamic dress. That the principle here should be that people should be free to wear the headscarf or not free to wear the headscarf as they choose. But I know many people in Tower Hamlets, women in Tower Hamlets, who feel under significant pressure to wear the hijab. And I know a Labour councillor who is physically attacked for it.
I was hoping you'd answer the question that
that's the problem. Well, no. You're asking me what the problem is.
So you're giving me a specific example of where it's failed, then?
I'm giving you a specific example of where it's failed, because I don't think that kind of behaviour.
Multiculturalism doesn't work.
Well, let me finish. Like I say, I think it's more nuanced than that. I think aspects of multiculturalism quite clearly have failed, and one of the problems about multiculturalism is that it tolerates practices that would be unacceptable in one community in other communities for the sake of multiculturalism. So, for instance, there's been a huge amount of focus recently on grooming of children, sex abuse by Pakistani taxi drivers mainly. And for many years that was ignored by the authorities because they were worried about being accused of racism.
Were they?
And there was absolutely, that's what the official inquiries found. Now that did enormous disservice to the whole Pakistani community, which has been unjustly smeared as abusive. But it was largely prompted by a fear of being accused of racism.
So the belief that putting multiculturalism on a pedestal has led to a certain suppression of the truth.
I think it's led to tolerance of some practices in some communities by officialdom, which wouldn't be tolerated.
The failure to investigate sexual crimes is a systemic failure in British policing across the board.
No, it's
not. Well, hold on. It is in relation to the number of successful prosecutions achieved by police services, and it is by the victims of sexual abuse, women, who report consistently that their cultural attitude, the gender-specific attitude of investigation authorities, be they police or the CPS, is always one that turns a victim into a suspect in terms of investigation. So I don't think it's true to suggest that these sorts of crimes are the special preserve of a single group.
All I'm doing is talking about the official conclusions of several official reports into this scandal.
We've got that there are lots of official reports on everything. It doesn't actually mean they reflect the reality on the ground.
Well, they probably know a bit more about it than us because they spent months inquiring.
Well, I'm from that area of the country, and I can tell you that sexual abuse.
Okay. The other side of the pen.
I'm sorry, but we were getting far too narrow here. Let's say that Andrew Gilligan's broad point was that being overly respectful of certain cultures has led to certain practices enduring which are just not tolerable in Britain.
I have a question for actually Andrew on that. When you mentioned about the headscarves, because you're trying to say that forcing people to wear it or not wear it, I'm trying to understand how this is linked to we're being too PC, because if someone is forcing someone, that is a structural issue, that is something the Muslim community would need to deal with. But are you trying to say that the forcing for Muslim women to wear the headscarf is an issue that curtails the freedom of women? Because
I think Andrew's saying that subcultures exist. And there are practices which are just not tolerable in the broader British society.
But they're patriarchal issues.
That is true, isn't it?
But they're patriarchal issues.
Across the board.
Across the board. They're not to do with cultural religion. They're actually patriarchal issues. And that is something...
I'm afraid that's not true. There is no compulsion to dress in a particular way in white Christian communities. There is significant pressure on women in parts of Tower Hamlets to dress in a particular way.
So
and I know a lot of...
should adopt white Christian culture then?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that everyone should be free to dress however they wish, and they shouldn't be placed under pressure if they don't wish to.
But you'll find all cultures have their certain types of pressures, Andrew.
Hindu women wear...
Patriarchal pressures on women's dress codes.
I
mean, we had it in the city, didn't we?
To give you an example, a Labour councillor
Let's talk heels in the city.
A Labour councillor in Tower Hamlets, a Muslim woman, was systematically harassed for refusing to wear a headscarf. Threats, intimidation, anonymous letters, excrement through her door, that kind of thing. And she went to the police, and the police weren't interested. They took the view that it was a Muslim cultural issue. That's what I mean about multiculturalism.
But that's the police's issue. That's not
I'm sorry, the
point?
police were using multiculturalism as a way not to suppress unacceptable behaviour.
So the failure of multiculturalism is clearly on the part of, you know, the institution,
Well, I'm not
the cultures
disputing.
themselves.
Well, I'm not. We're not arguing about where the failure is coming. We're arguing about particular instances of failure. I'm not disputing that.
Then can you extrapolate from that multiculturalism is?
I said, as
I think,
and the example I gave was,
I think
was
we need to think about multiculturalism also as a relationship between the government and minority communities. That if you have the government, when migrants come and the government says we will only listen to you if you classify yourself as Muslims or as Pakistanis, if you speak to us in these terms and not simply as workers, say, if the government's going to encourage that kind of interaction, then that will mean that Pakistani Muslim workers will not develop links of solidarity to other working class Britons, and will also exaggerate their religiosity. And that may be the kind of situation where people engage in sort of harder policing of social boundaries, but also an ossification of religious culture. It's one of the reasons that I think British Islam doesn't have the strong sort of Sufi strands or the role for Shia voices that you see in the Middle East or Pakistan.
When we say, has multiculturalism worked, let's just put a name or a face on the other side of that equation. It worked for who? So, for example, in this country, the big immigration points were 50s, 60s, with the Windrush, with the Caribbeans, with the Asians and so on. Well, has it worked for, who has it worked for and who has it not worked for?
Well, if you mean in economic terms,
yes.
Has migration had a deleterious effect? There's clear research from the Migration Observatory in Oxford to say that the average effect on incomes is absolutely minimal. And there's no downward pressure on average on wages and employment. That's on average, and if you're right at the bottom of the economy, if you're an unskilled worker, then there may be a small effect. But the effects of migration policy are very insignificant compared to education policy or healthcare.
Well, it's worked for the NHS.
Talking about a different subject.
It's worked.
It's about immigration.
It's worked for the NHS. I mean, you know, NHS is the finest in the world, even though it's under strain financially now, and that's because of the diversity of the staff that have come from many countries around the world in it. It's worked in our schools because we've got schools that are performing better, where you've got a more diverse and inclusive teaching staff. The pupils respond to that, and their educational performance.
We're talking about multiracialism. Multiracialism is absolutely fine.
But is multiculturalism a necessary price for the immigration that was necessary in order to support this economy, for example?
No, I think it's the consequence of almost neglect. British tolerance is really kind of indifference. People turned up in quite large numbers, and nobody really cared what happened, and nobody thought about the social impact. So they were allowed to develop separately. Then a kind of doctrine of multiculturalism was sort of back announced to justify it, and actually we need to be like
just explain that point, back announced in order to justify it. In other words, we brought them to this country to do jobs we needed to do, and an unintended consequence, which I'm now taking credit for, is we have multiculturalism, which is a good thing, isn't it?
Yeah, separate communities were allowed to develop, and that wasn't through any specific act of policy. Actually, it was just an act of indifference.
It was housing policy
and it was
that was adopted by Labour councils throughout this country for years, in which they distinctly determined geographical areas as being solely for white or other ethnicities. And that was ended in 1989 through a CRE, Commission of Race Equality action, that brought that to an end. So partly what you're seeing is the historical reality. In relation to this separateness of these communities, the reality is that I recall communities desperately seeking to get integrated services, not being able to challenge the institutionalized racism of those services, and therefore, as a necessity, they developed separate services. Because in the absence of that, they wouldn't have had anything. And then they are blamed for the very thing that meets their needs.
There are communities.
I think we are.
There are communities.
Remarkably.
There are communities within Britain, are there not, that self-segregate, that wish to stay among
but there is a minority.
Do they or do they not?
The whole
minority.
The whole segregation is a process.
There are minorities that want to go around killing people.
There's a self-segregation is a process issue, right? It's a process issue. When you came into this country as early migrants, let's say from the 60s, the Mirburys all moved to like Bradford, whatever. That was comfort for them because they knew everyone. They all moved in together. It was where the jobs were. They were going for the factory jobs. And then people just stayed there and they invested and then they bought houses and then their kids grew up there and then that's how it's developed. But those same people still go out and work with different cultures. They still go to schools in mixed environments. The geographicness, saying that people live in, I'm not going to make an effort to move out of Walthamstow just to prove that I need to create some multicultural environment. I don't.
I think that the difficulty here is actually something that you said. It's about how government's chosen to engage with these communities, and they do see them. They do try and put people in boxes. You know, you are a Muslim, and you know, actually, that might not be the most important part of your identity.
But that's a response to institutionalised racism.
You
must put people in boxes. If they're discriminated against.
Islam's not a race, you know, other parts of your identity might be more important. You might be, you know, Pakistan cricket supporter. You might be an accountant. You might be, socialist.
Let me ask you.
But you're defined by too many in this country.
We've talked about whether it's worked for the government or for the business elite, but what about for immigrants themselves? There are many, many stories, including in that report, where in just one generation, the immigrants have gone from their parents being perhaps at the lower end of the economic scale, cleaners or perhaps waiters, whatever, to becoming, you know, people who work at policy think tanks or lawyers or doctors. There are many, many examples of that. Is that an indication that multiculturalism can work?
I don't think
well in this country.
The thing is, I don't put that down to multiculturalism. I put that down to everyone's struggle to do well in this country and everyone trying to access those equal opportunities. Let's for example say South Asian first generation.
But they were given those opportunities and supported.
They were supported, but when they went to school, they were treated as an equal as a normal child, and you know. They weren't given extra support to become a doctor. That was what they were getting, the support they were getting from home. They weren't given tuition in those days. They used to work hard. They had to do well.
Provided,
South Asian parents went hard.
Grants were provided.
No,
not when you're at school.
Grants were provided.
At university, not when you're in school, because that kind of level of education, if you're going to be a doctor, you start preparing in that position from school, right? Your parent has a dream for you. There's a big stereotype about South Asian.
It's not multiculturalism. It's not the government or the support from the society that they're in. It's only their own efforts.
Or your schooling efforts, you know.
I don't think we should just be talking about economic success. I don't think that's the criteria for the success of a multicultural environment. I'd say it's to do with the development of generalised trust throughout society. You know, sharing values, not to saying there's a static set of values to which everyone has to subscribe, but everyone bringing a different script, a different narrative, and saying we're going to develop values together.
Isn't that about if people, different communities have different values, you're going to have conflict?
Well, actually, there's been remarkably little conflict compared to almost any other place. But I think the point you raise is very important. I think most people of all ethnicities and faiths in this country want to feel part of the country. But we have allowed, in some parts of the BME community, we've allowed groups to spring up which want to separate and which promote separatism and promote tolerance.
I would say.
We have many schools.
If you look at white flight in schools, it is a recognised trend.
Well, we have many schools, we have many mosques which teach
white flight occurs. And white people move out of an area that is diversity.
We should not tolerate
it's white families are running away from diversity where it occurs in those local schools.
I just want to get some final thoughts here before we end the programme. Andrew Gilligan, do you think that this country, or all countries, would be better off, more cohesive, if they had one dominant, homogenous culture?
I think most people of all races and faiths in this country want to belong to the country. And I think what we've seen in the last few years is the rise of separatist groups that are trying to stop them belonging and to try to say that other groups are inferior. And that's wrong, and that shouldn't be tolerated under the guise of multiculturalism.
Heena, the same question.
Yes, so agree with Andrew to the extent of this whole inferiority complex. It's mainly, there's still the white saviour, superiority complex, colonialist ideology still exists in this country. And we need, if we're talking about multiculturalism, we need to talk on an equal footpath. Integration happens from both sides of the stick, both sides of the spectrum. And when we're talking about multiculturalism, I think we've got to talk about respecting each other and not the need for assimilation.
Philip, is a country better off if it has one dominant homogenous culture?
No, we need to recognise that we can build an integrated culture together, a mutually integrated culture, which draws on many different origins. And the root of that is going to be better, more critical education in areas like religion and history.
Lee?
I think that certainly multiculturalism and a multiracial society, to take on the split definitions, is the way forward for the United Kingdom. I think that multiculturalism is very much been labelled identifying black and ethnic minority communities' resistance to racism.
Has multiculturalism been successful in this country, in this city?
Well, I think it has in London to a certain extent, because I think that, you know, very much we are one of the hyper-diverse cities in the world, and we see less problems than some other cities. Where I think there is a problem is that for multiculturalism or multiracial societies to work, the fundamental value and principle has to be equality before the law, and we don't have equality before the law, and therefore you don't really have multiculturalism in the sense that you mean it.
Well, perhaps better socialisation is needed, and a willingness to accept change. Whatever your view, there's always room for greater tolerance in our societies. That was Roundtable with me, Matthew Moore.